Off the coast of Nagasaki, there is an island that looks like a battleship floating on the sea. From a distance, its concrete walls rise directly from the water. Its apartment blocks stand abandoned. Its windows stare out toward the horizon like empty eyes. Today, nobody lives there. But less than a century ago, this tiny island was one of the most densely populated places on Earth. More than 5,000 people once called it home. Children attended school here. Miners disappeared underground every day to extract the coal that helped power Japan's industrial growth. Then, almost overnight, everyone left. The island was abandoned. The buildings remained. And the silence never left. Known officially as Hashima Island, but remembered around the world by a different name, Gunkanjima, Battleship Island. And behind its crumbling concrete skyline lies a story far stranger than most ghost legends. Because the real history of this island may be more unsettling than any haunting. At first glance, Gunkanjima doesn't even look real. The island measures only about 16 acres in size, small enough to walk across in minutes. Yet for decades, thousands of people lived there surrounded entirely by open ocean. The reason was hidden beneath the waves. In the late 19th century, large coal deposits were discovered beneath the seabed around Hashima. As Japan rapidly industrialized during the Meiji era, coal became one of the nation's most valuable resources. Factories needed it. Railways depended on it. Warships consumed enormous amounts of it. The island quickly transformed from a small rocky outcrop into a major mining settlement. As more workers arrived, space became a serious problem. There was nowhere to expand except upward. Concrete apartment buildings began rising from the island one after another. Some became the earliest large reinforced concrete residential buildings ever constructed in Japan, designed to withstand powerful typhoons that frequently swept across the region. By the 1950s, Gunkanjima had become a self-contained city in the middle of the sea. There were schools, shops, restaurants, public baths, a hospital, temples, rooftop gardens, and even a movie theater. To outsiders, the island looked overcrowded and harsh. To many residents, it was simply home. Children played in narrow alleyways between apartment blocks. Neighbors knew each other by name. Families built entire lives on a piece of land smaller than many city parks. And every morning, hundreds of miners descended deep beneath the ocean floor. Few people outside the island ever saw where those tunnels led. But beneath the crowded apartments and busy streets, another world existed. A dark labyrinth carved through rock beneath the sea. And it was there that the true story of Gunkanjima began. Every morning before sunrise, the island would come alive. Because of the mines. Long before tourists arrived with cameras, before the island became a symbol of abandonment, thousands of workers began their days the same way. They gathered near the mine entrances and descended into a network of tunnels hidden beneath the sea. And these weren't ordinary coal mines. The shafts stretched far below the ocean floor. In some places, miners worked hundreds of meters beneath the surface, with nothing above them but layers of rock and seawater. The deeper they went, the hotter it became. Temperatures underground could become unbearable. The air was thick with humidity, coal dust clung to skin and clothing, and ventilation was a constant challenge. Workers often spent entire shifts surrounded by darkness, broken only by artificial light, and the sound of machinery echoing through narrow passageways. It was dangerous work. Rockfalls, equipment failures, flooding, and gas-related accidents were risks miners lived with every day. Most shifts ended without incident, some did not. Yet despite the dangers, the mine continued expanding year after year. Coal was valuable. Japan's economy was growing rapidly. As long as the tunnels produced fuel, more workers arrived, and the island kept growing. Above ground, life looked surprisingly normal. For many residents, Gunkanjima wasn't a prison. It was simply where they lived. But life on the island came with one strange reality. No matter where you stood, the ocean was always there. Outside the apartment windows, beyond the schoolyards, past the concrete seawalls that surrounded the settlement, an entire community living on a piece of rock in the middle of the sea, dependent on a mine buried beneath it, and eventually, that dependence would become its greatest weakness. For decades, it seemed like the island's future was secure. Then, the world changed. After World War II, countries around the world began moving away from coal and toward oil. It was cheaper, easier to transport, and increasingly became the fuel powering modern industry. The change didn't happen overnight. At first, few people on Gunkanjima had reason to worry. The mine was still operating, and life carried on much as it always had. But by the late 1960s, the signs were becoming harder to ignore. Demand for coal was falling. Production slowed. The future that had once seemed guaranteed suddenly felt uncertain. Then, in 1974, the announcement finally came. The mine would close. For the residents, the decision wasn't simply about losing jobs. The entire reason the island existed was disappearing. Without the mine, there was no economy, no purpose, and no realistic way for the community to survive. People began packing their belongings. Families said goodbye to neighbors they had known for years. Children left classrooms they would never return to. One by one, ferry boats carried residents back to the mainland. What had taken decades to build unraveled in a matter of weeks. And then, just like that, it was over. The streets emptied. The apartments went dark. The sounds of daily life vanished. The last residents left behind more than buildings. They left calendars hanging on walls, school supplies sitting in desks, forgotten household items tucked away inside rooms that would remain unopened for years. When the final departures ended, Gunkanjima fell silent. Not the peaceful silence of an island at rest. The silence of a place that had been abandoned so suddenly that it felt as though time itself had stopped moving. And as the years passed, nature began reclaiming what people had left behind. When the last residents left Gunkanjima in 1974, they expected the island to become empty. Instead, many people believe it became something else. For years, nobody lived there. Typhoons battered the concrete skyline again and again. Yet despite the silence, stories continued to emerge from the island. Most didn't involve dramatic apparitions or violent hauntings. They were stranger than that. People described hearing sounds that shouldn't have been there. Footsteps echoing through empty corridors. Metallic knocking noises from buildings with no electricity and no occupants. Voices carried briefly by the wind, only to disappear when someone stopped to listen. At first, these reports were easy to dismiss. An abandoned island is rarely silent. Wind passes through broken windows. Loose metal rattles. Waves strike the seawall day and night. But over time, certain stories kept returning. Different visitors. Yet often the same descriptions. A feeling of being watched. The sense that someone was standing nearby, just outside their field of vision. The impression that the island wasn't as empty as it appeared. One former visitor later described walking through an abandoned apartment block and hearing footsteps from an upper floor. At first, he assumed another tourist had entered the building. When he looked up, there was nobody there. The sound stopped immediately. Another account came from a photographer exploring the island during a guided visit. Reviewing his images later, he noticed what appeared to be a human figure standing near a distant window. He had no memory of anyone being there when the photograph was taken. Whether it was a trick of perspective, lighting, or something else remains unknown. But stories like these became increasingly common. And before long, Gunkanjima's reputation began to change. It was no longer known only as an abandoned mining settlement. It was becoming known as one of Japan's most haunted places. Many of the island's most unsettling stories don't come from the apartment buildings above ground. They come from what lies beneath them. Even today, most of the old mining tunnels remain inaccessible. Some have collapsed. Others were flooded after operations ended. Large sections of the underground network have been sealed off for decades. Very few people know exactly what remains down there, and that uncertainty has fueled countless stories. One of the most persistent legends claims that sounds can still be heard from deep below the island, just faint noises that resemble distant hammering, a metallic rhythm, like someone still working in the dark. The story appears in different forms depending on who's telling it. Sometimes the sound is heard near old mine entrances. Sometimes it seems to come from beneath abandoned buildings. In other versions, visitors describe hearing what resembles tools striking rock somewhere far underground. Of course, there are practical explanations. Old structures shift. Metal expands and contracts of the wind. Wind and waves create strange acoustics across the island. But what keeps the stories alive is how often they return to the same image. Miners, still below ground, still working. Other accounts focus less on sounds and more on sudden feelings of unease. Several visitors have described reaching certain areas of the island and feeling an immediate urge to leave. Some reported becoming anxious for no obvious reason. Others said they felt as though they had stepped into a place where they weren't welcome. It's impossible to measure experiences like that, yet they appear again and again in personal accounts. As the story spread online, another belief began to emerge. Some people wondered whether the island's reputation had less to do with ghosts and more to do with memory. Thousands of people spent their lives here. They worked here. They raised families here. Some never left. And perhaps that's why so many visitors describe the island in the same way. Not as a place that feels haunted, but as a place that feels occupied. As though the past never completely moved on. And after sunset, when the ferries are gone and the sea surrounding the island turns black, that feeling becomes much harder to ignore. Most people only ever see Gunkanjima in daylight. Tour boats arrive in the morning. Visitors follow designated routes. Guides explain the history. Cameras come out. And a few hours later, everyone heads back to Nagasaki. By evening, the island is empty again. At least, that's the official version. Over the years, a number of paranormal groups have visited the island or its surrounding waters, hoping to document unusual activity. Some brought audio recorders. Others used infrared cameras and environmental sensors. Most left without finding anything they could prove. But not all of them came back with the same conclusion. One recurring claim involves voices. Not clear conversations. More like fragments. A word that seems to come from nowhere. A distant response when nobody else is nearby. An extra voice appearing during playback that nobody remembers hearing at the time. Skeptics point out that open water can play tricks on sound. Voices from boats can travel surprising distances, especially at night. Wind can distort audio in ways that make ordinary noises seem human. Still, the recordings became part of the island's growing reputation. Then there are the sightings. A figure standing briefly in a doorway. Someone appearing at a window several floors above ground. Movement in a building that should be completely empty. The details change depending on who's telling the story, but one thing stays remarkably consistent. The figures are never seen clearly. They're always gone a second too soon. A turn of the head, and whatever was there is no longer there. Maybe that's why the stories spread. What they offer is uncertainty. And Gunkanjima seems built for that kind of uncertainty. An abandoned city surrounded by water, hundreds of empty rooms, miles of dark corridors. A place where every shadow already looks like it's hiding something. Standing there, it's easy to understand how a noise becomes a voice. After a while, you start checking empty windows without even realizing you're doing it. By the time Gunkanjima reached its peak, thousands of people were living on an island barely large enough to hold them. Apartments were packed tightly together. Space was limited. Life revolved around the mine. And beneath all of that was work that most people would never have wanted to do. The tunnels stretched deep beneath the seabed. Shifts were long. Conditions could be brutal. For many miners, it was simply part of the job. For others, there wasn't much choice. During the war years, labor from Korea and China was brought to mining operations across Japan, including Gunkanjima. The subject remains controversial to this day, but what isn't disputed is that many people endured harsh conditions while working in places like this. Some never made it home. And that's where the island starts to feel different from a lot of other supposedly haunted locations. Most haunted places have a single tragedy attached to them. Gunkanjima doesn't. Its history is layered. Decades of difficult work. Thousands of lives compressed into a strip of concrete surrounded by open sea. When visitors talk about feeling a strange atmosphere on the island, there's another reason Gunkanjima refuses to disappear from people's minds. The island doesn't feel old enough to belong to the past. When we think about ruins, we usually imagine ancient places. Gunkanjima isn't like that. The people who lived here weren't distant historical figures. Many are still alive today. Some former residents can still point to the exact apartment where they grew up. They remember the schoolyards, the rooftops, the crowded hallways between buildings. They remember what the island sounded like when it was full of life. And that's what creates the strange contrast visitors experience today. The island exists in two versions at the same time. The one that stands abandoned in the sea, and the one that survives in memory. Maybe that's why so many photographs of Gunkanjima feel unsettling, even when nothing paranormal appears in them. The buildings aren't frightening by themselves. The feeling that an entire community was somehow removed, leaving only the shell behind. Whether Gunkanjima is truly haunted is a question nobody has been able to answer. And honestly, that may be the least interesting mystery on the island. Because long after the stories of shadow figures, strange voices, and unexplained footsteps are stripped away, Gunkanjima remains unsettling for a much simpler reason. If you enjoyed tonight's journey into one of Japan's most infamous abandoned places, subscribe to Whispers Beyond Archives for more forgotten histories, urban legends, and mysteries that refuse to fade away. Because sometimes the most haunting places aren't the ones hiding ghosts. They're the ones that remind us how quickly an entire world can disappear.